Hi, and welcome back. We're going to cover personal security and risk management, covering the CISSP Chapter 2 in this lecture. This is going to go along with the ITS 277 program. In this chapter, we're going to cover personal security policies and procedures, risk management, social engineering, and security awareness, education, and training programs. Following our roadmap for this course, you will see that now we are into Unit 1, which is our software assurance unit, covering risk management and vulnerabilities. We're going to continue on with Unit 1 for a couple of lectures to cover BCP and controlling access, and then assessment and testing. So our first section is on policies and procedures, and I realize policies and procedures can get kind of dry. So this is trying to make it a way for you to protect your company from risks that go along with actual people. So we're always going to refer to humans as the weakest link in our chain. I can make a program that is going to make it so that everything is secure and protected, but invariably people have to use it, and those people can have risks associated with them. So this section is going to cover the security policies and procedures for personnel, people working in your company. So first and foremost, when you want to hire somebody new, you need to think about how you are going to advertise that program or that job description, and then how are you going to handle the interviewing process and the hiring process. It's very important. First thing you always have to start with is a job description, because from a job description, we can determine what are the responsibilities and the tasks of that job. If that job requires certain security issues, we need to think about those ahead of time so that we can limit our enrollment options to people that are going to qualify for those security issues. So is there specific security access that must be required? Do you have access to the building after hours? Do you have to access confidential data? Is there privileges that you might have as that job description that we need to think about from a security point of view? Job descriptions should also be reviewed periodically, like at least once a year, to make sure that whatever access we gave to those people is still appropriate. Are you still doing the job necessary for those security privileges that you were given? Maybe you thought that a job was going to entail some sort of after-hours work, and then you found that you really didn't. There was no real reason for you to ever be on campus or on the building sites after hours. So maybe we should remove that access. Maybe we should think about ways from a security point of view to make sure that your security access is commensurate with the responsibilities and the tasks that you were given. So we've made our job description. People have applied to our job. At this point, we need to start thinking about screening our candidates. Which candidates are applying, and are they appropriate for the security features that they must be required to have? So you're going to check their work and education history, their policies. You might have drug checks. You might check their social networking. If you see a person who tends to publish business information on his social media sites, maybe that's something that you don't want. So check the social networks that exist out there. Make sure that you actually check work and educational history. Not saying that you tend to lean towards fudging your resumes a little bit, but some people tend to be a little bit exaggeratory. You want to make sure that the work and educational history is actually accurate. There have been situations where somebody says they have a degree, nobody checked the references, they find out 5 years later that they didn't have the degree. So check your work and educational history. You also want to check your references. Generally, employers that are on the list of references are going to have a good experience with that employee. Do you ever put someone down for a reference that's going to say, no, this is a terrible employee? But you still want to check. Some prior employers have limitations on what they can or will say. Yes, he worked here from this date to this date. That's usually a given. You can pretty much verify with HR that the employment date's given. Questions about how was his work history? How did he show up on time? Did he follow the rules? So on and so forth. They may not give you that type of information, but it's always a good idea to check. Some people are much more open and honest about the type of employees that they were, and therefore the employers that are giving you the reference checks are going to give you a good experience of whether that person is going to mesh with your society, with your environment. You also want to, of course, verify your education, check for transcripts and certifications. If they say that they're CISSP certified, are they? Go check the certifications. Make sure if they got the Network Plus exam, check their certification. If they did a Network Plus exam, but they did it 10 years ago and they never renewed it, that might be an issue. So just because they say that they have certain certifications may not be exactly what you need to do. So make sure you always check your education. Sometimes in certain jobs you have security clearance. And then, of course, you have to always be aware of legal issues with discrimination. Just because a person is of a certain age, gender, sexual orientation, race, so on and so forth, ethnicity, you can't differentiate or discriminate on any of those reasons. So you can't look at someone and say, oh, I think that you might be a bad person because of X, Y, and Z personal prejudices you have. You need to be careful when you are screening that you are not limiting people based on things that could be a legal issue with discrimination. Always an important part of your screening process. Once you have selected your candidate, you go through an interview process. Make sure that each person has the same equal treatment through the interview process. If you're interviewing people that are out of state and you're interviewing online for the first interview, everybody should be interviewed online. You shouldn't have some people in person and some people online, even though they may have the ability to do so, simply because it limits the experience and it changes the experience for different candidates, and now they are no longer being treated equally. Be aware that your hiring decision, your choice of who you're going to pick, must be legally defensible. You must not be in a situation where anybody can come back to you and say you hired someone discriminatory or, nepotism, or for whatever reason. Your hiring decision, you have to be able to legally defend that you chose this person because of these reasons. Sometimes in job descriptions, if they're in computer fields, you will do a skills challenge. Something along the lines of, here's this computer, go write this software program, go show me how you would figure this out, go to the admin screen and figure this out, how would you change passwords, just so that they can see whether or not the candidate is being honest about their experience and their knowledge. You also want to make sure that you identify any issues that would technically disqualify an applicant. Again, reference checks, background checks, so on and so forth. Anything that would become a security issue. So if there are security issues that are involved, you need to be aware of those early. And sometimes they can be an uncomfortable situation, but you need to be aware of them now before you hire the person. You need to ensure that all of the requirements and acceptance are documented by both HR and your applicant. What is their salary? What is the expectations for their job description? Are they expected to show up at 8 in the morning, or can they show up at 9? Do they have to show up 5 days a week? Are they expected to work overtime? Are they expected to work after hours? Make sure that the salary is written down and signed and documented. There's been many situations where someone says, hey, great, we want to offer you this job. Come on in. And the employee thought that they were making, say, X dollars an hour, and in fact, it was actually $2 less per hour, or a different salary amount. They didn't understand what the expectations were on the timing. So you expected them to show up at 8, and at 9:15 they come waltzing in, and you're like, why are you here so late? Well, you didn't tell me what my expectations were. If I'd known, I wouldn't have taken the job. Make sure all of these expectations are in writing, explained and signed by the candidate prior to actually bringing them on board. So, onboarding is a way that we describe the first day of work. For whatever reason, today is the day that you are starting at this job. So once you are hired, every employee should go through an onboarding process. Every company should have an onboarding process, which should be documented and made sure that everybody follows through with all of these requirements. So, documentation, when the employee is brought in, make sure that all these employee agreements and policies are signed and reviewed. So your official start date, your salary, how you're handling benefits and insurance, things like this. And then, of course, we have our NDA and our AUP. So our acceptable use policy is the description that describes the ways in which you're allowed to use the technology or the computers on site. Can you use your work computer to look at your personal email? Can you use your personal computer to look at social media? Can you use your YouTube account or anything like that on your company computer? The reason why we need to make sure the acceptable use policy is in place is to make sure that there are no security risks associated with certain behaviors. If you're checking your personal email and you get a spam email, which you then click, which then violates the entire network, that can be a problem. We can have things that we control in the business's point of view, but if you're checking personal information, you may put the company at risk. So acceptable use policies explain what is and isn't allowed to do with company policies, company computers, company hardware. An NDA, or a non-disclosure agreement, is usually signed prior to telling you anything personal, internal about the company. It is a legally requirement binding document that requires you as the new employee to keep all trade secrets and confidential information. This becomes kind of an issue in situations where you might have a whistleblower or something where something's going on in the company and you feel like talking about it. This also happens in a completely unnefarious way of saying, I'm going to go home and talk to my spouse about what happened at work today, not realizing I'm divulging company secrets. The spouse didn't sign an NDA. They can go tell anybody that they want. They might go tell their friend who tells another friend, and this is how company secrets can get leaked. We really need to make sure that we have them understand everything that is required in the NDA. So when they sign it, they understand it's a binding contract, it's legally required, and you are not allowed to talk about this with anybody else outside of this company. From a social point of view, this is also the day that you take people around, introduce them to the team, show them how to park, show them where the restrooms are, show them the expectations of clock in, clock out, where are you supposed to be, what is the expectation for how you keep your office environment. Some people have very strict office environments, no personal pictures, things like that. Some are really lax. Make sure that you understand all of that the first day, because it's really embarrassing a month later when you're like, hey, I haven't been able to find the bathroom yet. Yeah, that's a conversation that should happen on your first day. And the most important probably of your first day of work is getting you computer access, figuring out the level of privilege and access for each individual employee as they come in. Now, when you set up your computer network system, you probably have some sort of a access management system, an Active Directory, or something that includes different roles and different ways of being able to describe someone. If this role is a faculty member here at the school, they have X amount of privileges. You want to always follow the principle of least privilege, which means you give me the absolute least amount of privilege necessary for me to do my job. So whatever my job is, I should not have access to anything above and beyond that. Now, your job description may change over time, and you may need to request further access as time goes on, but you always want to pull it back to the least amount of privilege as much as possible. Once an employee is hired, now we need to have employee oversight. And there's a couple of different descriptions of employee oversight and how those need to be included in your job on an ongoing basis. The first is reviewing and auditing your job description, your tasks, your privileges, and responsibilities. Again, when you start in a company, sometimes people say, we're going to give you the least amount of privilege when you start. However, as time goes on, you might start to develop what we call privilege creep, where I'm going to give you the privilege to be able to access this printer or this network because you have a project that needs to access that. Once the project is over, you should pull it back, take back that privilege. But most of the time we don't, because we're just not thinking about it constantly. So you always need to be reviewing the job description to make sure that privilege creep doesn't happen. Obviously, if privilege creep exists, that can lead to security violations, which then lead to increased risk of people getting into areas that they shouldn't be into. And of course, if their computers or if their network gets affected by some sort of a virus and they have access to secure confidential data, you need to make sure that that privilege creep doesn't become an increased risk of security violations. One of the options that we do sometimes in computers, especially in confidential situations, is mandatory vacation. A mandatory vacation requires somebody else to perform your duties for like 2 weeks. You can't access your computer at all. Can they solve your problems? Does the world fall apart if you're not there? The problem with most companies is that people get very comfortable in who is doing what job. That job may be a little bit higher stress than it was supposed to be. It may be a little bit over the original responsibilities and tasks required, but it also may be certain things that you don't realize the other person is doing. If you couldn't access your computer for 2 weeks, would the company fail? Or can someone else do all of those duties? So being able to find out what the work duties are. This is also a inadvertent way of checking for abuse, fraud, or negligence. Is somebody underdoing their job? They're spending too much time on things that they shouldn't be. This job should be able to be done in an hour. It takes you 3 hours. Are you being lazy? Is there fraud? Are you lying about anything? Is there any abuse going on? By making someone take over your job description for 2 weeks, it allows that to be brought to light and verify what your job duties actually entail. In line with this is the concept of job rotation or cross-training. If you have 3 people in a room and each of them has the ability to do each other's job, and you could rotate those jobs, first off, it adds a little bit more excitement into the company. You aren't doing the same job over and over again. You know you're going to be switching to a different job. If that job is boring, you know you're going to switch to a new one soon. You can kind of do that rotating concept. But it also makes sure that there is no one person doing just one job. We call this separation of duties. Being able to make sure that every job is able to be understood and completed by different people. It isn't one person who is making an invoice, doing the sale, doing the collecting the money, and delivering the product all at the same time, because that's a pretty open thing for crime or neglect or fraud or abuse. And we want to avoid those from a security point of view. From a security point of view, you always want to be a little bit mistrusting and a little bit aware of human nature. And people have a tendency to either be forgetful or simple negligence or actively being nefarious, doing bad things in their own time. So when we have several people working together to commit a crime, we call that collusion. So if you have separation of duties, again, with 3 employees all doing the same job, for a crime to be committed there, for fraud or abuse to be going on, all 3 people have to be aware of it. That's called collusion. So when you hear the word collusion, it usually means multiple people being aware that a crime is being committed. If you're embezzling funds and somebody else is taking over your job every 2 weeks, they should probably know that you're embezzling funds because they can audit it and they can check it as well. So if they're going to be okay with that, then that's collusion. And if they're not okay with that, that will bring the fraud to light. We can use user behavior analytics or user and entity behavior analytics to analyze the behaviors of a person to identify breaches, exploitations, and vulnerabilities. Generally, I tend to lean towards trusting more than I ought to, but you should always be aware. Trust but verify. Make sure, yes, of course, all of my employees are wonderful and great, and none of them would ever do bad things. However, if they are uncomfortable with you seeing what they're doing on a daily basis, tell me what you did today. Let me sit and watch you for 12 hours and see what you do in a day and make sure that it matches up with what I think you're supposed to do. Most people are fine with that because they pretty much work all the time. But if somebody is doing something, again, nefarious, something underhanded, they might be a little uncomfortable with having somebody watch them. So analyzing your behavior to identify, is there any security issues that are available, and how can we fix those or put you in a position where you cannot put the company at further risk. So for whatever reason, this is your last day at this job. So your job may go to another place in the company, and it may be that you are removed from the company entirely. This is called offboarding, to balance with onboarding. You come on board, you leave by offboarding. When this is your last day at the job, if this is voluntary, you choose to quit, you choose to leave, you choose to move to a different direction, sometimes that's a little easier because there's not as much animosity going on. However, everything needs to be done in a specific time. So timing is really necessary when this is your last day at the job. If this is your last day in this job, you need to make sure you review any computer access. If you're moving to another place in the company, don't just keep your privileges as you were. You should actually completely remove access and then re-add it as the new employee. So don't remove your access until the employee knows, which is usually done in the exit interview. There's been situations where an IT staff has shut off access early, and so the employee suddenly knows there's something wrong. I don't have access today. What's going on? I don't know what's going on. Oh my gosh, is the world ending? So be very careful about timing. Remove all computer access, but we generally don't remove the accounts. We disable them, but we don't remove them. And the reason why is we leave them up for auditing purposes. Usually auditing is over a month or 3 months or maybe even a year. And if you remove the account entirely, it throws off the audit. You need to just disable the account, make sure that they can't do any more work on that account, but it is still available for auditing purposes. Any certificates, any permissions that are given should be revoked. Any access codes or keys should also be canceled. When you have your last day at work, again, voluntary versus involuntary. If it is voluntary, you know this is coming and it's fine. If it is involuntary, you might be a little bit anxious. You just got fired. This is not a good thing. The employee is usually a little uncomfortable at this point. Make sure that you document the end of the contractual agreements that have to be signed both by the employee and the supervisor. Make sure that all company assets are returned. If they have their computer, their phone, anything that is related to the company, all assets should be returned immediately. If they left them at home today, you need to find some way of getting them back. They should get their final paycheck that day in a physical check rather than a direct deposit, but we do direct deposit a lot these days, so it's fine. But you should say, this is your final paycheck. Your last day of work is today. This is how it's ending. And remind them, your NDA, your non-disclosure agreement, is retained even after you leave. Your employment agreements are retained after you leave. You still can't talk about company projects and stuff that you know from the company after you've been fired. Your NDA is still in place. And then, of course, is your exit interview. Generally, your exit interview involves something along the lines of, please come to my office. You should always have an HR person with you, or at least an extra witness, sometimes a security guard, at least somebody else to watch. The exit interview, if it is involuntary, can get a little heated, and you want to make sure that it stays private and respectful. You are not trying to embarrass the person. You are not trying to make them agitated or upset. You are simply saying that their services are no longer desired at this company for whatever reason. Again, voluntary versus involuntary. Your direct supervisor should always be the one who terminates you, but you should always have an extra person in the room. You also need to inform any physical security that you have on campus. Physical security guards who can say, this is this person's last day. They should not be on campus after this. And they should be technically escorted off the premises. The direct supervisor can do it. If you're concerned about your physical safety, you can have the security guards do it. They should be allowed to go back to their desk to obtain their personal items with an escort so that they can't take anything. And this is generally how an exit interview works. Again, if it is involuntary, people are usually really upset. Very few people get fired and smile on their way out the door. But you want to make sure that they don't have the opportunity to take anything that isn't theirs, that all of the computer assets are returned, that their computer access, especially things like VPN access or remote access, is removed as soon as possible. And be aware, in this field, if you are in an IT field, IT people, security people, and program people have a large amount of knowledge that could be a security risk. The joke is always, as a programmer, I could write a piece of software that would, destroy the whole company in 5 minutes. It's not that hard to do. If you give them that opportunity and they're angry enough, those kind of things can occur. So you want, from a security point of view, you always want to be looking at, how can I ensure that I am doing everything possible to make sure nothing nefarious occurs as a result of this? They are escorted off the premises. We usually fire people on Fridays so that they have the weekend to simmer down. Do it at the end of the day, unless you are firing them the first thing in the morning and then you're immediately doing it. You don't do it at noon. Because it's possible that they're going to find out about it in the middle of the day and then do something while they still have access. So offboarding can be a really large, encompassing thing. It isn't something where you just get mad at someone and say you're fired and get out. You have to follow the legal procedures of documentation. You have to make sure that their security access gets removed, and you need to make sure that they removed from the building safely and securely. Sometimes you have a tendency to work with vendors or consultants or contractors. Contractors, vendors, and consultants do not follow the same onboarding and offboarding as employees. They are different. You can have a risk involved by bringing in an alternate source of your talent. So hiring people involves W-2s, and it involves employees, it involves taxes, it involves HR, it involves a whole lot of things. Bringing in a vendor or a consultant or a contractor to come in and do the work makes it a little bit simpler in the fact that you don't have to go through all of that. However, In those same situations, those security things that we talked about with employees, you just aren't doing the same amount. You're not running through a background check on every single employee of a vendor. That would just be silly. You just trust the vendor. So you have what we call a multi-party risk. When more than one party is involved, there's increased risk. Does the company, XYZ consultant company, have the same security requirements that you do? Make sure that your objectives and your expectations, your timelines, your budgets, and your security priorities are all in line with each other. That your consultant or your contractor follows the same expectations on security priorities. Are they going to make software for you? Great. Are they going to follow your same security procedures? Maybe. Make sure. So make sure that whenever you bring in a consultant or a contractor, you understand those roles and how they work together. When you hire a company, you sometimes have what's called an SLA, or a service level agreement. This is to ensure what we call minimum service, especially on vital resources. So when we make a relationship with, say, Microsoft or Amazon for using the cloud, or we bring in a third-party consultant, we guarantee that our web server that you're going to be using is going to be up 99% of the time, which means out of 100 hours, I can guarantee you that 99 of them will be open. 99 is actually really bad. It should be like 99.9, but that's the logic. And you have to understand what your SLA is. If your SLA says 99% of the time, and you have your website up for 3 months, and then it's down for 2 days, because that's 99% of the time, and it works out just fine with your timing for it to work, are you okay with that? I mean, as the person who's purchasing the software or the web services or whatever, okay with the minimum service. Sometimes you have to pay more for a higher level of service or pay less for a lower level of service. This is actually why a lot of companies offer a free web service or a free situation with a minimal SLA. We guarantee you 95% uptime. If you want to pay for better uptime, we can make it 99.9, but you're going to have to pay for it. So a lot of times our SLA is the thing that's different in those situations. Make sure that the expectations and the penalties of violating the SLA are understood. If your web service is supposed to be up 99.9% of the time, it goes down for 24 hours, we are not going to charge you for that month's service. That would be the expectation and the consequence or penalties of violating the SLA. Very rarely is it, oh my gosh, and we're taking you to court and we're going to sue you for $1 million. It's usually something like, we're going to change your pricing scheme, we're going to offer you something in return. The term outsourcing simply means that we are going to use an external third-party vendor. We are not using our internal talent. So our internal employees who have gone through all of our security checks, following all the rules we just talked about, we're going to outsource. So we're going to use a third-party vendor. That increases the risk of trade secret theft, espionage, all of these kind of things, simply from the fact that A, you haven't gone through the security features, and B, there may not be that company loyalty. Once you are hired in by a company, you tend to have loyalty towards that company. They are your company. You feel a possession towards them. They take care of you, you take care of them, and there's a loyalty going on. When you hire a third-party vendor, they don't care. They may, or it depends on the vendor, about you and your personal company. They just want to follow their rules. So the risk of theft and espionage going on is a little higher when you bring in a third-party vendor. There are companies out there that produce products like vendor management systems, which are software solutions that help you manage your services and products, make sure you find a vendor that is going to be in your security framework, whatever you understand as security, and how that is going to be done. And finally, for this section, we're going to talk about compliance and privacy. So compliance simply means that you follow the rules. You follow the rules, the regulations, the policies, and the standards. All the rules in the world don't help if the people don't follow them. So if the speed limit says 70 and you drive 75, you're not following the rules. Having a sign up there that says 70 and not enforcing that means that the rule becomes moot. It doesn't make any sense. Nobody follows it anyway. You need to make sure that failure to comply with the regulations, the rules, and the policies and standards results in a security risk for your company. This company itself may be subject to fines and jail time if those standards don't get followed. So there are compliance rules related to PII, personal information, identifiable information, that Companies have had huge fines and penalties laid against them because a company employee worker did not understand that lack of compliance results in tangible consequences. Compliance enforcement is the application of sanctions or consequences for failing to follow that policy and training. And a couple of the examples below are HIPAA, which is revolving healthcare, the SOX Act, which is involving banking or security investing, FERPA, which is related to education, and the GDPR, which is the EU's version of PII. A lot of companies in the United States have started to become multinational, and they start to use companies that are in the EU or other places across the world. Those countries may have different requirements than what you're expecting. There may not be a compliance requirement in the United States, but there may be one in Europe, and you need to be aware of those rules just as much because you can be fined by the same regulatory environments. If you fail to follow those rules, you need to make it very important and very understandable to your employees that failure to compliance can result in termination of your employment, sanctions, financial consequences, and so on and so forth. So make sure that those rules are understood and that the people around you that you're working with understand them well. When it comes to privacy, privacy can mean a lot of different things. Prevention of unauthorized access to PII, personally identifiable information, freedom from unauthorized information, access to information. In other words, I can't go in and look at my boss's personal information. That would be my boss has an understanding of freedom from me, unauthorized access, looking at their salary, so on and so forth. And freedom from being observed, monitored, or examined without consent or knowledge. The most important part here is without consent or knowledge. Most people think that there is an expectation of privacy. You go into your office, you close the door, you have privacy. I can talk about whatever I want in my office because my door is closed and I have an expectation of privacy. However, in some companies, privacy is not a guaranteed. It's not something that you can have on company premises, company property, so on and so forth. Does the company have the right to add spyware to your your hardware, your computer? Some companies do. And as long as you have been given the consent that, yes, I understand my computer can be monitored, then you have given consent, you have the knowledge, you can be monitored and observed without additional knowledge. Be aware that some companies require this. This is not unusual. If you're in a high-risk, high-confidential environment, they might have security cameras. They might have cameras on the computers. They may have keystroke loggers. They may have different spyware-type things to make sure that you are not going onto social media and that you are not looking at your personal email and that you are not divulging company secrets. This relationship with privacy becomes a huge balancing act between the employee and the organization. As an employee, do you want to work in an environment where you're constantly being watched? As an organization, do you want to have employees that you have to constantly watch? How do you balance this? Do you just do spot checks? Do you allow yourself to be monitored but know that it only occurs occasionally? Do you choose to say, no, I don't want to be monitored? How do you want to handle that privacy issue? The U.S. regulations listed to the side refer mostly to PII. So PII, personally identifiable information, generally includes things like your name, your personal email, your home address, your phone number, so on and so forth. From there, we can have sensitive PII, which is like your social security number, your driver's license number, your financial banking account numbers, your biometrics, especially if paired with medical information, ethnicity, sexual orientation, passwords, social security numbers, 4 digits, date of birth, so on and so forth. If you give someone your name and your date of birth, and that's available to the rest of the company, you have now exposed PII. PII is a huge deal when it comes to regulatory rules, HIPAA, SOX, FERPA, GDPR. And you can, again, be fined as a company and be sanctioned. There are significant consequences to making that information available when it shouldn't be. Now, obviously, the HR department has to access this information. They're allowed to have it. But did they accidentally bring home a file on their personal thing and their spouse was able to see it? Did they expose that PII outside of the company? There are a lot of risks that occur when dealing with privacy, and you need to be aware of them in a security field. Thank you for watching this section on onboarding and employee management. We're going to go into the next section in risk management and how we calculate that in our next video. Thanks for watching.